What a pretty song from Josh Warshawski, the same album we've been working our way through. Havarai Nevarech, Friends Let Us Bless. That song is called Emet, or the more Ashkenaz pronunciation, Emes, truth. Ein lanu melech, there is no other king but God. How's everybody doing? I know we're doing a little bit of counter-programming here. There might be some guy on TV speaking matters of importance, but you'll hear all about it soon enough. Isn't it great to be learning some Torah together? Let's light up the darkness. All right, who is with us as we gather to learn on a Tuesday? Gabriel in Mexico. Bienvenido de México. Qué bueno que estás con nosotros. Sharon loves that song from Lebanon, New Jersey. Renee in Indiana. Elvis in New York. PK in Colorado. Melissa in Great Neck. Pauline in Arkansas. David in South Bend. Rebecca's going to watch the State of the Union. She'll catch the replay later. Jose in Miami Lakes. Lucy in Minnesota. Paula in the Great Northwest. Welcome. And on the YouTube side, Aoife in Florida. Tonight's episode of AT Daily, sponsored by our friend Michael Waterman, dedicated to Amitai Ben-Ami, LA Hebrew High School educator. Beautiful dedication. May Amitai be showered in blessings, and Michael, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. And we say Amen, and thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. I am wearing a t-shirt from Yitzi Hurwitz's 50th birthday party that just happened, I guess it was Sunday night. And Yitzi's a very inspiring figure, a Chabad rabbi who has Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS. And for a number of years now, I mean, the only thing that he has movement, that has control over the movement is his eyes, right? So his entire body is not in his control. And, you know, his wife, Dina, and their many kids, you know, it's just a heroic family. But Yitzi, who's made a song very famous that he wrote before his illness, set on Shine a Little Light. Shine a Little Light. You can find a great video of all the Jewish singers, in all the stars in the Jewish music world singing Shine a Little Light. That's on YouTube. And but Yitzi still shares Torah. I mean, it's exhausting for him. He writes Devar Torahs, right? He writes Torah teachings with his eyes, right? Just letter by letter, looking at it, writing, you know, editing. And he just, I mean, he's such an inspiration to so many people around the world. So I'd also like to dedicate our learning tonight to Yitzi Hurwitz. I was able to tell him at his birthday party that I daven for him every day. If you'd like to join me in davening, his name is Yosef Harav, right? Rabbi Rav Yosef Yitzhak ben Bracha. Yosef Yitzhak ben Bracha. I pray for his healing and for his strength and his ability to continue to inspire people around the world with his beautiful Torah. All right, we have a double daf tonight. There's going to be no class tomorrow night. There's a Rosh Chodesh event that I'm going to be a part of, so I'm not going to be available to teach tomorrow night. But we're not going to fall behind schedule because we're going to do 2 pages tonight. Perfect timing to do a double daf. We're doing pages 20 and 21, and 21 is very short, so it works out really well tonight. And we're going to be completing chapter 2 here in Tractate Chagigah, 13th volume of the Talmud. These are the laws of the festival offerings, which had to be brought in a state of purity, and one has to be in a state of ritual purity when one enters the temple to bring an offering during the pilgrimage festivals. And so now we're encountering kind of an extended discussion of various laws of ritual purity, how to purify oneself, how to prepare to be ritually pure, how to guard oneself so that one should not become ritually impure. And as I always keep repeating, we must understand that unclean is not the same as impure, right? These are not laws of hygiene. A person could be scrubbed clean, not one speck of dirt on them, no germs, no cooties, but they could still be tameh, ritually impure, and they could become ritually impure as a result of doing a mitzvah, right? Of fulfilling a commandment, like burying a dead body or engaging in peru urevu, right? Procreation. When one is engaged in procreation, he becomes or she becomes ritually impure and might need to immerse before entering the precincts of the holy. So we continue, picking up at the very bottom of 19b. Rav Mari said, so they learned from the Mishna, this fourth Mishna in chapter 2 that we've been discussing, that non-sacred produce that was prepared according to the level of ritual purity required for sacrificial food, right? So it's a very high level of ritual purity. You're going to be very, very careful when you are bringing an offering that's going to go up on the altar, some of which, like a festival peace offering, will be eaten by the owners. But the required level of ritual purity is very high. So if you immersed only or wash your hands only to eat a meal that included bread in it, but didn't have in mind that you would be preparing to eat of the holy, as it were, then you're not ritually prepared and you're considered tameh and have to prepare yourself anew, as it were, to reach that level of purity that you could eat from sacrificial foods. So they learned from the Mishnah that non-sacred produce that was prepared according to the level of ritual purity for sacrificial food, i.e. with the same stringencies as required for sacrificial food, is like sacrificial food. So according to this teaching, so you took the stringencies on yourself. Just you were going to eat non-sacred food, but you treated the experience as if you were going to be eating from the most holy offerings that were going to be brought to the altar. So then, can we look at that non-sacred food itself that you're going to come into contact with? Is it going to have the level of purity that sacrificial offerings would have? So that if your non-sacred food itself came into contact with liquid and with those sacrificial offerings, would it render the sacrificial offerings impure? According to this, no. And it is deduced from the fact that it is not taught in their regard that those who eat non-sacred produce according to the level of ritual purity required for sacrificial foods must treat the produce with a higher standard with regard to their degree of purity, like those who actually partake of sacrificial food. Now the Gemara asks, but perhaps, and we're on 20a now, perhaps the reason for this fact that a higher standard is not taught with regard to those who actually partake of sacrificial food is that these foods are not on a distinct level of ritual purity, as if they are similar to the level of teruma, right? So teruma is that portion of the produce that is set aside, the first portion of the produce, right? 2% of the produce of a harvested on a farm, or it could be olives, could be grapes, whatever. It's going to be given the teruma gadola to priests, and only it becomes consecrated food that only priests can eat, and the priest must be in a state of purity when he eats teruma, and the teruma must be in a state of purity when it is eaten by the priest. So that's a very distinct level of purity with all kinds of associated rules and safeguards. So is eating sacrificial foods a distinct level like teruma? It's considered to be a higher requirements of purity, but is it as distinct as teruma? Right, so perhaps the reason for this fact that a higher standard is not taught with regard to those who actually eat sacrificial food is that these foods are not on a distinct level of ritual purity, as if they are similar to the level of teruma, well, teruma has already been taught. And if they are similar to non-sacred produce, well, non-sacred produce has also already been taught. As we learned in a Baraisa, that they are not considered to be on a level of their own. Non-sacred foods, prepared according to the level of ritual purity for sacrificial food, are actually considered to be like non-sacred food. Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Tzadok, says they are like teruma, but not like sacrificial food. Therefore, the fact that this level is not explicitly mentioned affords no proof. So this idea that somebody might take on the stringencies required for eating sacrificial foods when he's just eating food that is non-sacred, chulin, right? Just mundane food, has no consecration, no inherent sacredness in the food, just regular food. The person put up upon himself the stringencies to eat it as if he was eating sacrificial foods. So now that he's done that, does this non-sacred food acquire a level of purity? Not a level of holiness, but a level of purity analogous to what? To just non-sacred food? Or to teruma? Or to sacrificial food? So it seems like it's treated like sacrificial food, according to the view that we're examining now. And the proof is derived from the last clause in the Mishnah. Yosef ben Yoezer was the most pious member of the priesthood, and yet his cloth was considered impure by the treading of a zav, as if somebody with gonorrhea, high level of impurity, had stepped on it, with regard to those who ate sacrificial food, right? He's a priest, so he eats teruma. Sometimes he eats of sacrificial foods, but unless he's prepared himself to eat sacrificial foods, his clothing is considered impure and would render sacrificial food impure if his clothing came into contact with it. Yochanan ben Gudgada would eat non-sacred foods prepared according to the level of ritual purity required for sacrificial food all his days, and nevertheless his cloth was considered rendered impure by the treading of a zav for those preparing the purification waters. Those who are involved in the highest level of purity is required for the person who is preparing the waters of purification, mixing the ashes of the red heifer with the waters of sprinkling, so that people who came into contact with a corpse before they could enter the temple would have to be sprinkled with that water. And the person who prepares that water himself has to be at that highest level of purity. And so if he came into contact with the cloth of this priest who maintained himself at the highest possible degree of purity all the time, so that he treated even non-sacred foods as if they were sacrificial offerings, nonetheless, the one preparing the waters of sprinkling, if he came into contact with the clothing of that guy who lives his whole life at such a high level, since that guy wasn't preparing to make the waters of sprinkling, it would render this person impure, and he'd have to purify himself again before creating the waters of sprinkling. Now, the Gemara infers from this, for the purifying waters, for the sprinkling waters, yes, his cloth was considered to have ritual impurity imparted by the treading of a zav, the one with gonorrhea. But for sacrificial food, no, it was not considered to have ritual impurity imparted by treading. So apparently, he maintains that non-sacred produce prepared according to the level of ritual purity required for sacrificial food is like sacrificial food, as one who is particular to preserve the ritual purity required for sacrificial food, even with regard to non-sacred produce, is considered pure even with regard to sacrificial foods themselves. New subject. With regard to the particular care that must be taken to prevent any suspicion that one's clothes have contracted tuma, ritual impurity, Rabbi Yonasan ben Elazar said, if the shawl of one who was stringent with regard to ritual purity fell off him, he dropped his shawl, maybe his tallis, his prayer shawl, and he said to another person, give it to me, please pick up my shawl for me. And the person picked it up for him. Now that shawl is considered impure, even if the other individual is himself pure, since the person's attention was diverted at that moment from being cautious with regard to impurity. It is as though the shawl were rendered impure, right? You're keeping yourself at this state of maximum purity, so you don't let other people touch your clothing. If you let somebody who you didn't know what state of purity he was in touch your tallis, then you have to assume that the tallis became ritually impure, because you don't know. You can't know for sure. And even if it turns out that that person was absolutely in a state of purity, he just came out of the mikveh before he handed you your shawl, so we have no reason to suspect that he was impure and rendered your shawl impure. Nevertheless, the sages deem your shawl to be impure because you let it out of your guard for that moment. You were distracted. You said you just allowed someone to touch it that you hadn't ascertained what their level of purity was. Now, is this all craziness? Right? Why are they maintaining such stringent standards? Because when we're dealing with matters of holiness associated with the temple, entering the temple, bringing offerings in the temple, eating of the holy offerings in the temple, the part that is eaten by people, the sages want you to approach with this mindset of full mindfulness in everything that you're doing. Right? And if you drop your guard and just say, well, whatever, it's no big deal. It's very unlikely that anybody, came into contact with impurity before they touched my cloth. So then you're not being as careful as you could be. And it's necessary to be that careful in these matters of holiness. Now, we don't have a temple. We're not bringing offerings. We're not so careful with teruma and levels of tum and tahara these days. But where this really comes into play, and we might think about this as we're reading this, how many times do we go to a prayer service and drift off? I mean, I confess, it happens to me all the time. I just get some kind of a thought and I follow that thought, and then I realize, oh man, I better get my head back in the game, and I've missed a whole prayer, right? Now, I was not involved in that prayer. Whatever, merit might arise from praying that prayer, whatever spiritual experience I might have from praying that prayer, I didn't have it. Now, that's not to say that I didn't accomplish anything. Anytime you go to services and you sit in the room, even if your mind drifts, even if you're mentally, absent the whole time that you're there, you still accomplish something by showing up and being counted among the congregation. But the more present, the more mindful, the more dedicated we are to what we're doing when we're treating matters of holiness, the better. Holiness is not the time for autopilot, if possible. Okay. So with regard to this particular care, right? So if you dropped, even though you were very careful to maintain purity, but your shawl fell off you, somebody else picked it up, and you didn't know who that was or whether his state of purity was, we're going to just deem that shawl impure. Similarly, Rabbi Yonasan ben Amram says, if one's Shabbos clothes were switched for his weekday clothes, and he wore them, they are considered impure. His assumption that they were different clothes than the clothes he had intended to wear is enough of a distraction to spoil his caution against impurity. Even yourself, this could be a person who's very conscious to be in a state of purity all the time, to keep his clothes in a state of purity, but on Shabbos, he wore his weekday clothes by mistake, deemed them impure because he did not fulfill his intention with respect to Shabbos. And so if he was careless about that, probably there was space for carelessness to lead to his clothes being rendered impure. Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok said there was an incident involving two women who were wives of Khabarim. So Khabarim, these are the people who went above and beyond, right? They weren't priests. They weren't eating sacrificial offerings, all the time. But they would keep themselves in a state of ritual purity, immersing in the mikvah on a daily basis. Anytime they came into contact with something they couldn't vouch for, immerse again. And there were, the two wives of two such people were in the bathhouse. And their clothes got switched in the bathhouse. And the incident came before Rabbi Akiva, and he declared the clothes impure. Now, both women were from families where they were just living in a state, highest level of purity. There's no reason to think, none, that the clothes of either woman were tameh, were ritually impure. So the fact that they got switched, so what? They both come from families that operate at that level of purity. But since the clothes got switched, they can't be sure who it came from. There was a lapse of the shomer, right? A lapse of guarding against impurity, and so you assume impure. A state not so dissimilar to, where our minds have been during these last 2 years of COVID, just assuming, particularly the way it was at the very beginning when we were all so paranoid and washing down our groceries with Purell, etc. But you can never be sure enough, right? Rabbi Oshaya strongly objects to this. However, if that is so, one who that these two women who have no reason to suspect that either one of them was impure, but the fact that their clothes got switched, that means that both sets of clothes are going to be are deemed impure. Rabbi Shaya objects to this strongly, and he says, however, if that is so, one who inserted his hand into a basket to take a loaf of wheat bread, and a loaf of barley bread came up in his hand instead, in that case, too, will you say that the loaf is rendered impure? He knows that he's pure. He knows that his basket is pure. He knows that the contents of the basket are in a state of purity, but he pulled the wrong loaf out of his basket. Does that mean that it is now rendered impure? And if you would say, indeed, yes, it would be rendered impure, but isn't it taught in a baraisa? One who is minding a barrel to ensure its ritual purity on the assumption that it is a barrel of wine, and it is found to be a barrel of oil. It is ritually pure in the sense that it does not transmit impurity. So if you could pull out the wrong loaf and say that it's impure because you didn't get the loaf that you meant to pull out, what about this teaching that one who's guarding a barrel of wine to make sure no impurity comes into contact with it, and then it turns out he's guarding a barrel of oil? Nothing touched it. He made a mistake about what it was that he was guarding. Is that a lapse of mindfulness that's going to render it impure? According to that baraisa, no, nothing came into contact with it, so we have no reason to call it impure. And Rabbi Yirmiyah said, hold on. And this indicates that one's lack of knowledge with regard to the identity of the item that he is minding does not itself cause impurity. But the Gemara rejects this. It says, but according to your line of reasoning, say that the latter clause of that same baraisa, and it is prohibited to be eaten, which indicates that the supervision is insufficient in this case. The Gemara asks, why is it that the barrel's status is pure, and yet there is a prohibition against eating its contents? Right? So in that situation, you thought you were guarding a barrel of wine from becoming impure. It turned out to be oil. So it's not rendered impure, but it is prohibited to be eaten. Why? And Rabbi Yirmiyah says, and it is prohibited to be eaten, which indicates that the supervision is insufficient. And the Gemara asks, why is it that the barrel's status is pure, and yet there is a prohibition against eating its contents? If the supervisor's error does not harm the food's ritually pure status, one should likewise be permitted to eat it. And Rabbi Yirmiyah said the baraisa is referring to one who says, I guarded it from things that render it impure, but not from things that invalidate it. What does this mean? The Rid explains that this statement is not referring to the ritual impurity of the barrel itself, but to the liquids it contains, which are rendered ritually impure by coming into contact with impure objects. So although liquids can generally be rendered impure by all types of ritual impurity, there are exceptions to this rule, such as the contact of a tevel yom, an individual who has immersed and is waiting for the sun to set before he is fully purified, which only invalidates and does not render impure. And basically, you could think of the difference as invalidates. It can no longer be eaten in a state of purity. It's not considered pure for eating, but it is not impure with respect to transmitting impurity to yet some other liquid or food or vessel. So Rabbi Yirmiyah said the baraisa is referring to one who says, I guarded it from things that render it impure, but not from things that invalidate it. In other words, he was careful to guard it only from being rendered impure with a severe degree of impurity, which causes anything it renders impure to render others impure in turn, but not from that lesser degree of impurity that merely invalidates it for use, but does not enable it to render other items ritually impure. Since he guarded it from impurity, it is considered pure with regard to rendering other items impure, but it still may not be eaten, just in case it was invalidated by an impure object. The Gemara asks, and is there guarding by half measures? Can it be said that one was careful with regard to only a particular type of impurity? I mean, if you're guarding it from impurity, you're going to make sure that nothing touches it. How can you say you were only guarding it with respect to that higher level of impurity, but you were not guarding it with respect to a lesser level of impurity? Why would that ever happen? And the Gemara responds, yes, that can happen, as it is indeed taught in a Baraisa, if one inserted his hand into a basket that was filled with figs, and the basket was placed on his shoulder, and a shovel was in the basket, and his mind was his mind was on the basket to guard it from impurity, but his mind was not on the shovel, so then the basket is pure, and the shovel is impure. And the Gemara asks, why is the basket pure? Let the shovel, that is now you've said could be rendered impure, it should render the basket ritually impure, if the former is in fact impure. And the Gemara answers, the law is that a vessel cannot render a different vessel impure. A vessel can render its contents impure, but not a different vessel. Therefore, the basket remains pure. The Gemara asks another question, and let it render impure any food that is inside the basket, as food is not a vessel and can therefore be rendered impure by a vessel. Ravina said, the Baraisa is referring to one who says, I guarded the shovel from things that render it ritually impure, which is why it cannot render other objects impure. But I did not guard it from things that invalidate it, so it is impure. Consequently, there is no proof from here that the contents of the barrel in the earlier case may not be eaten. We still haven't figured that out. So returning to the prior discussion, the Gemara states that in any case, this teaching is difficult. Why should an object be impure just because the one that was guarding it was mistaken with regard to the identity of its contents, but he made sure nothing came into contact with it. He just was mistaken about what was contained in the barrel. He thought wine turned out to be oil. How would this accord with the Baraisa that explicitly taught that if one mines a barrel under the assumption that it is wine and it turns out to contain oil, the oil is pure and cannot render others impure? That is the teaching we're using, and they're extending it to the idea of the bread in the basket. So, and Rabba bar Abba raised a further objection. There was an incident involving a certain woman who came before Rabbi Yishmael, and she said to him, Rabbi, I wove this garment in a ritually pure state. I was ritually pure. All my vessels were ritually pure. The thread that I was using, there was no impurity in all of this. I wove this garment in a ritually pure state, but my mind was not on it to guard its state of purity. I was pure, but I wasn't thinking I need to guard it to make sure it remains pure. So in other words, although I did not intend to guard it in this manner, I am certain that no impurity came into contact with it. So Rabbi Yishmael started questioning her. Where were you? Where were you before? Where did you go after? What was in your house? And in the course of these questions that Rabbi Yishmael conducted with her to see if it had remained in a state of purity, she happened to mention to him, oh, Rabbi, a menstruating woman pulled the rope with me as I was weaving, and the garment was actually therefore rendered fully impure by a menstruating woman moving it. That's a type of impurity, just like a man with gonorrhea or a woman during her menses. If they come into contact with something or walk over or sit on, they can render an item impure. And so she was sure that even though she wasn't guarding it against impurity, that no impurity came into contact with it. But when she retraced her steps, she realized, oh, no, wait a minute. Yeah, there was another woman who helped me pull the rope, and she actually was in her menses. So yeah, this garment is impure. So Rabbi Yishmael said, how great are the words of the sages when they said, if one's mind is focused on guarding it, meaning its state of ritual purity, then it is pure. But if one's mind is not focused on guarding it, it is impure. End of story. Since she was not focused on preserving the garment's pure state, it contracted impurity without her noticing. And while that might be an infrequent occurrence, it happens often enough that it really justifies the sages making this statement that if you guard against impurity, it remains pure. But if you didn't guard against impurity, we assume that it became impure. There was another incident involving a certain woman who came before Rabbi Yishmael, and said to him, Rabbi, I wove this cloth in a state of ritual purity, but my mind was not on it to guard it from impurity. Same idea. And during the interrogations that Rabbi Yishmael conducted with her, she said to him, yeah, Rabbi, a thread of mine, of this garment that I was weaving, a thread of mine that was woven into the cloth snapped, and I tied it with my mouth. But she used her mouth on the thread. Well, it can be assumed that the thread became moist from her spittle, which means that if that thread was touched by a source of impurity, the cloth would be rendered ritually impure by contact with impure liquids. And this is because the sages decreed that any impurity that touches liquid renders the liquid ritually impure to the first degree, so any vessel that comes into contact with the liquid would be impure to the second degree. And Rabbi Yishmael said, how great are the words of the sages when they said, if one's mind is focused on guarding, it is pure. If one's mind is not focused on guarding, it is impure. In any case, if one intends to keep something in a state of ritual purity, a mistake on his part with regard to its identity is not considered enough of a distraction to render the item impure, unlike the Baraisa that explicitly taught that if one minds a barrel under the assumption that it is wine, it turns out to contain oil, the oil is pure and cannot render others impure. We know that if you don't keep your mind on guarding it, it's going to be deemed impure. But if you kept your mind on guarding that barrel to make sure no impurity came into contact with it, and your only lapse of mindfulness was that you made a mistake with respect to what's in the barrel, but no impurity came into contact with it, are we going to deem that impure or not? Likewise, according to... No. And the Gemara clarifies, well, granted, according to Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok, there is no difficulty, as in the case of two wives of the Khabarim whose garments were switched, it can be said that each of them says to herself, my colleague is the wife of an Am Haaretz, an ignoramus, right? One who cannot be trusted in matters of ritual purity. My colleague is the wife of an Am Haaretz, and not the wife of a Chaver. And she diverts her mind from her garments, as she is certain that they have already been rendered impure. And a distraction of this kind makes it likely that the garment contracted impurity, and it is therefore considered impure. And it's a different example than the one watching the barrel, thinking it's wine, and it turns out to be oil. And likewise, according to Rabbi Yonasan ben Amram, there's also no difficulty, as with regard to the case of one who switched his Shabbos clothes for his weekday clothes, it can also be said that since he is more protective of his Shabbos clothes, he will divert his mind from that higher level of protection if he thinks that they are weekday garments. A distraction of this kind makes it likely that the garment contracted impurity, and so we deem it impure. But according to Rabbi Yonasan ben Elazar, who deals with the case where one's shawl fell and another person lifts it up, why should it be considered a distraction? Let him guard his garments from ritual impurity while they are in the other person's hands. Why should they be considered impure? In other words, he's still thinking, I want to keep it pure. And before he says to somebody, pick it up, he might ask them, are you pure? Right? So the fact that another person picks it up doesn't automatically mean that he dropped his guard. Maybe he kept his guard up. And Rabbi Yochanan said, it is a presumption that a person does not guard that which is in the hand of another person. Since the object is in the hands of another, he will inevitably be distracted from guarding it. And the Gemara asks, and can one indeed not guard an item that is in the hand of another? We're on the B side of 20. But isn't it taught in a Baraisa with regard to one whose donkey drivers and workers who were Amei Haaretz, right? So he's got employees who are not, religious, observant, pious Jews who are very careful to maintain themselves in a state of purity, or at least to guard items that need to remain pure, that they would be careful to keep them in that state of purity. So with regard to one who employs donkey drivers and workers who are Amei Haaretz, and they were bearing pure food for him, right? So he's got food, like he's delivering teruma to Jerusalem to give to the priests. Now his workers, he probably told them this food can't come into contact with anything. Not a person because they might be impure, not any object or food or liquid that might be impure. We have to guard its purity. But his workers are typically in their own lives not so mindful of the laws of purity. So with regard to this person who's got these Amei Haaretz working for him and transporting pure food, so they were bearing pure food, and they were not, and they were carrying the pure food without touching the pure food itself, but only the earthenware vessels that contain the food. Even if he distanced himself from them as they walked by more than a mil, which is like a kilometer, his pure foods remain pure. Since the workers are unaware of his departure, he is still considered to be guarding the food, even though it's in the possession of other people. Right? So this is a proof being offered. Well, as long as I'm being mindful that my shawl has to remain in a pure state, why can't I remain mindful about it even when I ask somebody to pick it up? I didn't lose touch with the idea to guard that shawl. And here's an example from, this guy who's actually transporting food that must remain pure. He's using workers who are Amei Haaretz. They're not touching the food, but they're touching the earthenware vessels that bear the food. And we're going to consider that even if he loses sight of them, he gets like a mile away from them or a kilometer away from them, they're going to still consider as if he's guarding the food, like he's watching over them. So they're going to remain careful, like he instructed them, to make sure no impurity comes into contact with that food. And the Gemara asks, they're going to remain careful because he is supervising them. But if the owner of the pure food said to them, "Go, and I will follow behind you," then once they are no longer within his eyesight, his pure foods are deemed impure. So if the workers think he's watching them, they're going to be careful, and we're going to assume that no impurity came into contact with the pure food. But if the workers think, he's not really watching us closely, then we can't trust them to be sure that they didn't allow impurity to come into contact with the pure food. Now the Gemara asks, what is different in the first clause of our Baraisa, where the food remains pure, and what is different in the latter clause, when the food is impure? How do we explain that? Whether he didn't say anything to them, so he loses sight, but he didn't say anything to the workers, versus he says to the workers, "You guys go on ahead," meaning like they know he's not going to be watching them because he told them that, then we deem it impure. So what is different about these two cases? And Rabbi Yitzchak Nepacha said, the first clause is referring to one who purifies his donkey drivers and workers for this purpose, meaning that he ensured that they immersed and purified themselves beforehand so that concern for impurity was removed. And the Gemara questions this. Well, if so, then the latter clause, they should also be pure. If they were purified, what impurity are they going to come into contact with? And the Gemara answers, well, an Am Haaretz, right, an ignoramus who is not particular about the contact of his colleague is what we're concerned about. So the owner of the pure food had all his donkey drivers and workers purified so that even if they came into contact with the food, they wouldn't render it impure. But once he says go on ahead on their own, unsupervised, if they run into a friend of theirs who's another Am Haaretz, now we can't be sure that they will, guard the food from coming into contact with this third party who we're going to have to assume is in a state of impurity. And the Gemara counters, well, if so, in the first clause of the Baraisa, there should also be concern that they might run into a friend of theirs who is impure. The workers might run into a friend of theirs. And despite the employer's warning to his workers to stay ritually pure, they are not careful with regard to the impurity of some other third person. And the Gemara answers, the first clause is referring to a situation when he comes across them via a circuitous path. Since he is not walking directly behind them, but he can appear from their sides, they cannot always see him. Consequently, they are concerned that he may return at any moment, and they're going to be more careful. In other words, you have to, even though you trust your employees, you have to let your employees know that you are watching over them, that you make spot checks, right? That you're going to keep everyone at a higher level of purity by ensuring that they know they're being supervised and they can never be sure when you're going to come in and check out whether they're obeying your orders or not. If you don't do that, if you leave them unsupervised and they know they're unsupervised, then we're going to assume that that food could have become impure. And the Gemara raises a difficulty. If so, in the latter clause too, since he can arrive from around a corner at any given moment, they should certainly be cautious. And the Gemara responds, since he said to them, go and I will follow behind you, they rely on this. and they act as if they're unsupervised, and we can't assume they're going to maintain ritual purity of his pure food. And that concludes Mishnah number 4 of chapter 2, and it concludes chapter 2. We now go on to chapter 3 here in Tractate Chagigah. And we open chapter 3 with Mishnah number 1, a somewhat lengthy Mishnah. Concerning several matters, there is greater stringency with regard to sacrificial food than with regard to teruma. Okay, that makes sense. We're looking at eating sacrificial foods, right? Eating foods, part of which goes up on the altar and part of which is going to be eaten by its owner, requires a higher level of purity because it's a higher level of holiness than teruma, which is consecrated. Only priests can eat it, but they eat it every day. It's not as, sacrosanct as offerings that are brought to the altar in the temple. You don't have to eat teruma in Jerusalem or in the temple. You can eat it anywhere that a priest receives the teruma. But the sacrificial offerings, that's only going to be eaten in Jerusalem since they're brought onto the temple in Jerusalem. So it makes sense that concerning several matters, there's greater stringency with regard to sacrificial foods than with regard to teruma, a portion of the produce is designated for the priest. Now, this expresses itself in many ways. The first being that one may immerse vessels inside other vessels to purify them for teruma, but not for sacrificial food, for which one must immerse each vessel separately. Another difference of this higher level of stringency for sacrificial foods is that the laws of the back of a vessel and the inside of the vessel and the handle for gripping it apply to vessels used for teruma, meaning that each part of the vessel has its own use and is considered a separate vessel in that it does not convey impurity to other parts of the vessel when it contracts impurity. That's a nice leniency from the sages, that if a part of a vessel became impure, we don't have to disqualify all of the contents, just the contents that came into contact with that part of the vessel. But this may not be done with sacrificial food. With vessels that are used to transport sacrificial food, if any part of the vessel became impure, the whole vessel became impure, and any sacrificial foods in contact with it become impure. Likewise, one who carries an object that is trodden on by a zav, right, picked up the impurity of a zav, a man suffering from gonorrhea. One who carries an object trodden on by a zav may carry teruma at the same time if he is careful that neither he nor the impure object should come into contact with the teruma. But this may not be done with sacrificial food. The garments of those who eat teruma are like an object trodden by a zav with regard to sacrificial food. Now, the Mishnah lists other stringencies that apply to sacrificial food, but not to teruma. The characteristics of teruma are not like the characteristics of sacrificial food. As in the case of vessels that are used with sacrificial food, if one has a garment or vessel that is tied up, he must untie it and dry it if there was any moisture on it, as both a knot and absorbed moisture are considered interpositions that prevent the water of the ritual bath from reaching the entire garment when you would immerse it to purify it. And he may then immerse them, and afterward he may tie them up again if he wishes. But with regard to teruma, he may, if he so desires, tie up the garment and then immerse it without any concern that the knot might be considered an interposition. So the type of immersion, more stringent, more difficult, more time-consuming if it's going to be used with regard to sacrificial foods than with teruma. Vessels that were fashioned and completed in purity nevertheless require immersion to be considered pure for sacrificial foods, but not for teruma. A vessel combines all the food that is in it with regard to sacrificial food, meaning that if one piece of food becomes impure, all the other pieces inside the vessel become impure as well, but not with regard to teruma, concerning which each piece is treated independently, and it's only going to deem impure other pieces that it actually came into contact with. And the Mishnah continues the list of differences between sacrificial food and teruma. Sacrificial food that is impure with fourth degree impurity is disqualified, meaning that the sacrificial food is rendered impure, but it does not impart impurity to other items. Teruma is disqualified when it is impure with third degree impurity. It is not susceptible to fourth degree impurity at all. And with regard to teruma, if one's hands became impure by rabbinic law that renders only the hands impure, its counterpart, i.e. the other hand, remains pure. But with regard to sacrificial food, if one hand becomes impure, he must immerse them both because both hands are deemed to be impure. But with regard, he must immerse them both, as one hand renders its counterpart impure with regard to sacrificial food, but not with regard to teruma. One may eat dry foods, i.e. foods that have never come into contact with liquid and are therefore not susceptible to impurity. As we've discussed, dry foods are not susceptible to impurity until they come into contact with one of those 7 liquids and the owner of the food had volition that it would become moist with one of those liquids. Only then is it susceptible to impurity. So one may eat dry foods, i.e. foods that have never come into contact with liquid and are therefore not susceptible to impurity. One may eat dry foods with impure hands when it is teruma, but not when it is sacrificial food. And finally, an acute mourner, an onen, i.e. someone who has experienced the loss of a close relative on that day, who had not come into contact with the deceased, and one who is lacking atonement, i.e. someone who still needs to bring an offering to complete his purification procedure, such as a zav or a woman after childbirth, both require immersion in order to eat sacrificial food. The onen would immerse after the day has passed, and the one lacking atonement would immerse after the requisite offering is brought. However, immersion in these cases is not necessary for eating teruma. Now remember, only priests or members of the household of a priest can eat teruma, but nevertheless these rules stand. We are on page 21 on the A side. Just a few more paragraphs, and then I'll go to questions and comments. So the Gemara on this first Mishna of chapter 3. It is taught in the Mishnah that one may not immerse one vessel inside another if they will be used for sacrificial food, but this may be done for teruma. And the Gemara asks, with regard to sacrificial food, what is the reason that one may not immerse vessels in this manner? And Rabbi Illa said, because the weight of the inner vessel causes an interposition between the water and the vessels. That is, the outermost vessel weighs down on the bottom one, not allowing the water to reach the 2 vessels' point of contact. And the Gemara poses a question on this explanation. But is it not so that since the latter clause of the Mishnah mentions that sacrificial foods and teruma differ with regard to matters of interposition, so the first clause of the Mishnah must not be with regard to matters of interposition, but it is referring to a different consideration. As it teaches in the latter part of the Mishnah, the characteristics of teruma are not like the characteristics of sacrificial food. As in the case of sacrificial food, if one garment or vessel that is tied up, he must untie it and dry it, and he may then immerse them, and afterward he may tie them up if he wishes. But with regard to teruma, he may tie up the garment and then immerse it. And this latter clause shows that there the sages were concerned for any possibility of interposition with regard to sacrificial food. So most likely the earlier clause of our Mishnah is dealing with a different question, not whether interposition, meaning that when the thing is immersed in a mikveh, the water of the mikveh doesn't touch all of the thing that's being immersed because there's some kind of interposition, right? When a woman immerses in mikveh, a wife immerses in mikveh, each month after her menses and counting 7 clean days, she has to not only remove all her clothing, but all her jewelry, all her rings, untie any knots in her hair, nail polish, remove everything so that there's nothing interposing between her and the waters of the mikveh. So here we're saying, well, it seems like with teruma, there can be a little bit of an interposition. With sacrificial foods, nothing can interpose when you're immersing the vessel to purify it before bringing the sacrificial foods. That's with the issue of interposition. But it seems like in the earlier clauses of our Mishnah, they must have been dealing with a different issue. So what is it that caused it to work for teruma and not for sacrificial foods? And the Gemara answers, no, this is not necessarily the case. The earlier clause of the Mishnah might also be talking about interposition. In both the first clause and the latter clause of the Mishnah, the concern is due to interposition, and it is nevertheless necessary to teach us both cases. For had the Mishnah taught us only the first clause, i.e., that one may not immerse one vessel within another. I would have said that this is the reason one may not do so for sacrificial food is because there is the weight of the interior vessel that must be taken into account. But in the latter clause, where there is no weight of the vessel to be considered, things are tied together, I will say that it is not considered an interposition for sacrificial food either. And had it taught us only the latter clause dealing with knotted garments, I would have said that this is the reason one may not do so for sacrificial food, because it is possible that it is the nature of knots to tighten even more in water, creating an interposition that bars the water from entering all the way. But in the case of the first clause of the Mishnah, which deals with one vessel inside another, and where water by nature causes the top vessel to lighten and float away from the lower vessel, and so water gets in and around everything of the vessels, both vessels, I wouldn't have thought that that's a problem. Therefore, the Mishnah teaches us that that is also a problem, and therefore it is therefore necessary for the law to be stated in both cases. We're on the B side of 21. We're going to end there, and we'll pick it up on Thursday. I'll take questions now, but it's on Thursday that we're going to meet again. No class tomorrow night because I'm going to be at a Rosh Chodesh event. We begin second Adar, right? This is a leap year that we're in. So we're completing the first month of Adar, Adar 1. And because it's a leap year, there's an extra Adar, Adar 2 or Adar base, right? Adar B, which begins tomorrow night. And we have an event here in our community. Okay. Nina's passing me just a couple questions. Sharon, my other work is in the area of complex rehab technology. I work entirely at the Matheny School with folks needing alternative mobility and function. So many have amazing creativity that would otherwise be untapped. I think you must be talking about, in reference to, I was sharing about Yitzi Hurwitz at the top and how amazing that he's still able to teach and share Torah where he can only write by the movement of his eyes. That's all he has left in terms of controlled movement because of ALS. And it is so inspiring to watch people overcoming such challenges. So thank you, Sharon. And Yosef, there was a summary and commentary of one of the past few pages on the Steinsaltz website where I read along, and it mentions asmachta. I've seen a few definitions and none seem to get my full clarity. As far as I know, it's something like a rhetorical device. How would you explain this? An asmachta is not a simple subject. So I'm not going to go there tonight. Let me prepare a little bit to explain that when I come back. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us tonight. You should all be blessed to enjoy Rosh Chodesh beginning tomorrow night. Then it's Wednesday night, and then it's Rosh Chodesh Thursday and Friday. And, we're already in the month of joy with Adar Aleph, Adar 1. And as we enter Adar 2, which actually contains Purim in it, and which makes Adar the most festive, joyous month of the year, may we be blessed to rejoice like we've never rejoiced before. May we hear good news for the nation, for the world, peace in the war-torn areas. Let's only hear good news so that we can rejoice in unfettered fashion. All